now request Shri Nandan Nilekani to come on stage for his presentation. Nandan is the co-founder chairman of Infosys Technologies, founding chairman of UIDAI, co-founder chairman of Ekstep Foundation, and also a co-chair at G20 for DPIs.
Thank you very much, and it's, can you hear me? Yeah. It's a great pleasure to be here at this joint event by Sahamati and Vidhi. I thought I'll just spend a few minutes setting the context of how this whole area of governance of DPI has evolved. As you know, DPI itself is a new phenomenon, and the governance of that has also evolved over time, and I'll briefly touch upon that. Now, we know that, at least we believe that, the whole purpose of digital technology is to solve people's problems, and therefore we want it to be human-centric. We want to solve societal challenges, education, inequality, inclusion, and so on. We want to also at the same time unleash innovation so that more and more people create solutions that are useful to society. And we want to do it in a way that empowers people, empowers individuals, empowers small businesses. So that's our sort of worldview of how we think of digital technology for progress. Now, the internet, of course, is a phenomenal public good created by the US government spending billions of dollars. But essentially what happened was in 1995, the private internet began with the rise of Netscape and then other internet companies. But there were three fundamental pieces that were missing in that internet. One, it lacked verifiable identity. So there was no identity system in the internet. Second, it did not have a way to transfer value like money and make payments. And third, the individual did not have control over their own data. And that we saw, the consequence of that is what we see today, where you get your ID from different private providers, but then when you provide your ID, and then the ID also becomes the basis on which data about you is collected, because you don't have control over your data. And because you don't really have an efficient payment system, money is made through advertising, which again means there's more data collected about you. So fundamentally, there's a set of issues with the internet the way it is. Now, at the same time, while this was happening, India actually has built all these public goods. And there's many of them, I won't spend time on that, but I think the fact is that in the last 15 years, India has built a variety of public goods, identity, payments, consent, trust, credentialing, fulfillment, discovery, and so on. So all these are designed as DPIs, and I think as we go along, we'll talk more about DPIs as a construct. But how did we get there? How did India create a model of such an inclusive, open model for growth, and how did it bring it all together? And fundamentally, the piece that we have not talked too much about is really the governance piece of that. How did it all come together, and what was the evolution of the thought process that made it happen today? And we think that governance is as important as technology and the market. Now, clearly, we understand that the market, and India is a huge market, 100,000 startups, innovation, market, companies, value, venture capitalists, all that stuff. And we also know that technology standards are important from all the standards we have. But there's another piece of that is how do you have the governance infrastructure which enables this through laws, through regulations, through institutions that we create. And is there a method to all this? Is there a way to think about what are these other patterns and templates we can think about when we think about the governance part of digital public infrastructure? And this governance has to be embedded into the laws, institutions, and technology. So it can't be something outside. It has to be built in situ, inside the thing. And as Rahul says, regulators can regulate, but where regulators can regulate, but innovators can innovate. Now, this is a fundamental difference from the crypto kind of world, where they think they're outside the system, and therefore they want to, in some sense, create a parallel payment system or parallel currency. This is about how do we create innovation within the system, and how do we create the institutions, the regulations, the technologies, etc., the laws to make this happen. But this has to be done in a very cooperative fashion. Now, if you go back and look at 2008, India 2008 was still era of feature phones, STD PCOs, The smartphone had just come, Apple had just launched the iPhone, the Android phone was just about coming, cloud had just been launched by AWS. So all these new technologies were at the beginning. And India was also looking at how to build technologies to do development. And if you go back and look at the history, it actually began with something called mission mode projects, which were launched by the government of India in 2006 or so. Idea being that we should use technology to really do large transformations. And there were many, many ambitious mission mode projects. The passport project is one of them, income tax, MCA 21, even Aadhaar was actually a mission mode project. And it was also a realization that the kind of technological complexity that this mission mode projects had required you to go outside the government system, which is why they were all designed to be contracted out, and there was a whole process of RFPs and giving it to private sector companies and so on. And that began even in like 2006-07. Now, of course, in those days there was no smartphone, so clearly it was a PC-led or a workstation or a desktop-led approach to this, and it was not so much facing the consumer and having self-service as some kind of an assisted PC-based service model in all these applications. So you go to the passport office and they collect the information and so on. And this later on led to the idea of how do we create, as we got to the whole Aadhaar and all that, we realized that we had to think of them not just as applications but as platforms with APIs which you can use and embed in different applications. So the platform thinking essentially began with UPI, with Aadhaar. Now, one of the things we realized is that the standard model of contracting was not really sufficient for the complexity and sophistication that we needed, because you had to go with the lowest bid. The technological competence was not fully confirmed. Officers changed, and when you do very large technological projects, it's difficult to do it with a lot of entropy on the people side of things. So you needed a stability of people and so on and so forth. So a lot of things you needed to make it possible. You had to get access to the best technology. That means you had to get access to the best talent, which means you need a corporate structure or some structure which allowed you people with the best talent to come and work for large government projects. So all these things were there, and that's why around 2010 we had a committee which I chaired called the Tag Up Committee, which essentially looked at setting up what we called as national information utilities. Now, the idea being that you create a structure, could be a corporate structure or could be a statutory body, which is tasked with that particular job of running something which was very, very important at a national scale. Now, this was not a new idea in 2010. Earlier, we had the example of what happened during the capital market reforms of the mid-90s. CDSL and NSDL were set up in the mid-90s to dematerialize India's shares. NSE was set up. So we already had some experience in the capital markets of modernization through new institutions. And then, of course, in around 2008-09, the RBI decided to set up NPCI, where they used a non-profit structure. So by that time, we had this Section 8 and now earlier Section 25, Section 8 companies, and NPCI was set up by RBI. So the notion that, so we already had the concept of creating dedicated, technologically savvy institutions staffed with good talent to do a specific function. So this was already established. But the Tag Up report essentially laid the conceptual foundations for how to do this, why it should be done, and so on and so forth. So in the last 10 years, we have had several of these institutions. We don't recognize them as NIUs. An example of that, NPCI already existed. GSTN was set up. GSTN runs the entire indirect tax system of the country. GSTN is a unique company which is jointly owned by the state and the central governments. Then the Indian Highway Management Company was set up, which is jointly owned by the Ministry of Road Transportation and all the toll operators. That operates the FASTag system. The DigiYatra Foundation was set up. That's owned by the Civil Aviation Ministry and the airport owners, and that operates the DigiYatra system, where you can go through the airport just showing your face, and so on and so forth. So we have a large number of these essentially dedicated institutions that have a management structure which is much more continuous, which is much more durable, which is able to attract talent, and which has a better way of doing technology procurement, because that was another issue in technology procurement, that you ended up buying obsolete things. Now, AIDA was a good example of that, and there are broadly three parts to this. There's an institution creation. In the case of Aadhaar, it was a statutory body called the Unique Identification Authority of India. It had to be encrusted in law, and this was done under the Aadhaar Act of 2016. And the rules and regulations are defined by the UIDAI. So in some sense, UIDAI is both a regulator and a technology implementer. And then there were a set of technology protocols that were defined. What is important to realize is that all these three things were done together and not necessarily in the same order. So the normal thing would be get the law done, then build the institution, then roll it out. But we had to do all this in parallel. So Aadhaar was launched in 2009, whereas the actual law came into being only in 2016 because of the whole convoluted thing about whether Indians have a right to privacy and so on. So there's a whole Supreme Court case there. But fundamentally, all these things were in some sense parallelized, but they all came together, and today we have a stable environment where we have a law encrusted, we have a set of regulations under the law, we have a right to privacy under the Supreme Court judgment, we have an institution which is under the law, which is autonomous, and we have a set of technology standards we have. So this is how we sort of brought together institutions, law, and technology. Now this required even further refinement, because as we went forward, we realized that if you're going to do more and more of these DPI kind of things in financial services, commerce, mobility, it required new thinking and taking it further forward. And that's when the concept of protocols became, Pramod is here, he'll talk about it. But fundamentally, we went not just from creating institutions, but creating protocols that can be used for interoperability. And a good example of that in the internet world is the email protocol, SMTP. Everybody uses email. I don't care which product you use, but I send you an email in a particular format, you can read it. Whereas if I'm using some private interface, both of us have to have the same thing. As people who have tried to send me WhatsApp have found out that I don't have WhatsApp, so then they can't communicate with me, or with Pramod, two of us don't have WhatsApp. So anyway, so protocols are ways to connect things in a way that's interoperable. And in some sense, the first example of that was UPI, because UPI was a payment protocol. Remember, Aadhaar had solved the problem of identity, and we had talked about how one of the challenges of the internet was verifiable identity. It was solved there. We also had to solve the problem of value exchange, payments. And in the case of UPI, it's a slightly different thing, but if you look at the same three things, institution, legal, and technology, the institutional part of UPI was NPCI, the National Payment Corporation of India, which was set up by the RBI. Mr. Gandhi was here. He was part of the group that set up NPCI. And that was set up as a Section 8 company, non-profit company, initially set up with 10 founding banks, and now I think there are some 50 odd owners of that institution. So that was the institution part of it. Now legally, NPCI is regulated by the central bank and under two different acts. One is the PMLA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Essentially what happened was in 2001, after the 9/11, there was a huge amount of global concern about terrorist financing and all that, and a lot of things happened like PMLA Acts, the FATF, and so on. So all these are essentially to make the financial system more stringent in its verification of actors. And then, of course, that also included the Payment and Settlement Act, which defined the rules under which payments happen. So you had a complete set of regulations and laws which came under the payment side. The PMLA is administered, the P&S Act is administered by the Department of Revenue and so on. So there are a number of things there which are legal. And then, of course, on the technology side, it provided an open protocol. So the protocol really became much more possible, much more viable here. And that protocol allowed any value to go from any kind of account to any kind of account, and interoperable QR code and all the various things you know. And we have seen the power of that in terms of the fact that you have 50 million acceptance points for UPI QR code. Nikhil is here, he was involved with the early rollout, 300 million users and over 9 billion transactions a month. So this is a good example of how, again, using this concept of having institutional arrangements, having a legal infrastructure, legal and regulatory infrastructure, and having the technology standards and protocols, you actually can create a very vibrant system. Now, beyond that, now we come to today's thing, which is about the account aggregator, which is really the data empowerment piece of that. So remember, go back to what we talked about. We had to solve the issue of verifiable identity, solved with Aadhaar. We had to solve the issue of real value instant payments, solved with UPI. But we still had to solve the problem of how do we make people have control over their own data. And that's what the data empowerment architecture is here. I won't go into it, you know all about it. But what is important is that unlike the previous cases where there was Aadhaar or UPI, in the case of NPC, in the case of DEPA, we actually had to take a multi-sector, multi-provider approach, because data is not in one sector. You can say payments is something that comes under the central bank, so there's a regulator. But data is everywhere. Data in health should be under the healthcare regulator. Data in finance should be under the respective finance regulator, which means if data is about banking data, it has to be under RBI. If it's about market data, under SEBI. If it's insurance data, IRD, and so on. So you have multiple regulators and multiple providers. And therefore, this required an even further sophistication of the approach, because there was no central body to run all these things. It had to be everywhere. And that again, it happens in three ways. There is technology standards, APIs for data sharing. In the case of banking, it's done by Rebit, but there are, it'll be different. In the healthcare, it may be NHA. In education, it may be a third entity. So fundamentally, it's going to be multi-sector regulators. And of course, a consent standard, which is a unique example of a consent which is a legal concept embedded in technology, policy as code, as we call it. And this is now regulated by the Data Protection Act, which just got passed. And that is at the level of the act. But individual regulators, be it in the financial sector or otherwise, will then regulate the game in their particular sectors. And the institutional arrangements here are done through consent managers, which again in the case of the financial sector will be the RBI regulated account aggregator, which is comes under the FSDC design. So all the 5 regulators use the same consent managers. But tomorrow there may be consent managers in health who will be maybe regulated by somebody else, and they all have to register under the Data Protection Act. So this actually is an extension of a single regulator environment to a multi-regulator model. And then you have Sahamati, which is the co-host of this, which is essentially how do you, in this multi-regulator, multi-institutional model, how do you enable participatory governance? And that is being done by Sahamati. And this is actually example where there is not even a central institution, right? So far we thought about the fact that we had to have an authority or a company, and we find that there is nothing here. There is no institution, but it is a very powerful interoperable protocol. So it's a DPI that is interoperable and decentralized without a central institution, but the protocol and the rules and regulations around that and the laws enable this to function in different sectors. And we have seen the power of that in the financial sector alone, where today there are more than 390 financial institutions. They are either TSPs or FIPs, which are or FIUs or or AAs. I think every day RBI gives there are more AAs coming. So fundamentally, this is something which is this shows that you don't need to. And sometimes people can't get their heads around this because they think, oh, who's running this? Who's NPCI in this? There's no NPCI. It's an interoperable framework, but enabled through this combination of regulators and innovation standards. So this is the only country in the world where we actually have this population scale open protocols to transform our society. And the reason why it's difficult to do, it requires a huge amount of coordination. It needs coordination between, of course, technologists, market operators, regulators, government and lawmakers, lawyers. Everybody has to be in on this to put all this together. There are lots of moving parts, there are a lot of pieces. And they also don't come in a very neat, sort of sequential fashion. They're all happening at the same time. So even as you're developing the technology for AA, You're working with the government to make sure the data protection law has a consent manager in it. You're working with the regulators to lay down the standards. So this is it's not so straightforward to do this, but there are all these different pieces that we have to keep in mind as we move the system to a new level of equilibrium using these architectures. And this is very important that we have been able to do that, and this is something which has to be done to really get the full power of all this. So what we are seeing is suddenly exponential change which starts gradually, and all these things are now adding up to drive all the equitable economic growth that you see in India today. Now this has been obviously now been recognized around the world, and the last 1 year, thanks to the G20 role of India, I think all over the world countries are coming here. They're coming here. Last week the German minister bought some vegetables and all that. So fundamentally you have finally the world is waking up to the fact that DPI is a new epistemology, it's a new knowledge source which the world needs, and countries around the world are planning the proposal to get this rolled out in 50 countries in 5 years. Again, for that we are creating a special set of institutions, and in all the various agreements, it's coming in the obviously in the G20 documents, but even in bilateral. This, for example, when Prime Minister Modi met President Biden, they talked about DPIs. DPI is one of the paragraphs in the communique. So fundamentally, we believe that DPI, the idea which has all these complexities of technology, regulation, institutions, laws, standards, policy as code, etc., is now ready for global prime time, and we hope that in the coming years it will go everywhere. Thank you very much.